Good afternoon. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk this afternoon. Thanks to JJ for inviting me over. As JJ explained, it's everyone's favourite subject, the building regulations themselves, more specifically the impacts of the Building Safety Act upon the building regulations. You may well have heard some key terminology, principal contractor, principal designer. We're going to explain what that all kind of means and how it differs from other legislation. So that's me, Our Building Control Solutions. I'm co-owner and director of that. We're a private building control body based in the southwest and southeast of England. Can everyone hear me? All good? Shout if I'm going a bit quiet or whatever. So this is the contents of today's presentation. We'll have a look at the Building Safety Act itself, the changes imposed to the building regulations, including, as I said, principal designer, that terminology, which most of you will hopefully be familiar with, but explore some of the minutiae associated with it, and also the changes to the legislation associated with building control bodies, how anybody interacting with a building control body will notice these changes. And finishing off with how building control has changed up to now and how it's likely to change in the future, which will impact all of you guys in terms of when you interact with building control. As JJ said, I'm happy to take questions as we go. Feel free just to raise your hand or similar, but I'll try and explore some of those questions towards the end of the presentation as well. So, without further ado, the Building Safety Act is undoubtedly the biggest changes in legislation in the construction industry for over 40 years. It cannot be overstated the impact that this has on all of us, however we work within the construction environment or the built environment itself. When you're looking at what they've tried to achieve with these legislation changes, it's important to recognise where this has come from. So, Grenfell Tower disaster in 2017, biggest loss of life in the UK since the Second World War. And that has led to Dame Judith Hackitt's review in 2018, Building a Safer Future, and the Building Safety Act in 2022, and the subsequent changes to the secondary legislation, known as the building regulations, that have come into force as of last year. When we're looking at these changes and the entirety of the legislation, it's very difficult and easy to get bogged down into the detail. But what you need to bear in mind, and we will do in due course, but what you need to bear in mind is what they've tried to achieve is that any point throughout the construction, whether it's during design phase or the build phase, for any decision that is made, there is clear delineation of responsibility. So if you make a design decision and it goes wrong, there is clear delineation of responsibility in exactly the same way as things as they are built. And what we'll do now is explore how they've done this. So, the Building Safety Act itself, it wasn't like on the 1st of January 2022, the Building Safety Act came into force in its entirety. The way that the Building Safety Act works and legislation in the UK works generally is that there's transitional provisions. So over key dates, different elements of the Building Safety Act came into force. One of those key dates was the 1st of October just gone, so 1st of October 2023. And that's when the changes to the building regulations and also the changes to the approved inspector regulations came into force. And this is what we're talking about today. One thing I would say, just to provide a bit of context, the Building Safety Act is not just about building regulations, it's not just about building control. It's a huge, wide-ranging piece of statute. So, number of surveyors here within the room, Defective Premises Act that you may well be aware of. The changes imposed by the Building Safety Act purely relating to the Defective Premises Act are huge. So the extension of the time periods by which a defect can be taken against and those people be held liable for that defect that's been created has been extended, in some cases up to 30 years. And also the context to which the Defective Premises Act can be applied has also been extended. So previously it was just relating to new dwellings, but now it's relating to dwellings formed by a material change of use, existing dwellings and similar. So the scope of what is happening under the Building Safety Act itself, just relating to the Building Safety Act, is huge. Not only under the Building Safety Act, we created a new body known as the Building Safety Regulator, which some of you may have heard of. So The Building Safety Regulator has a huge remit. Not only is it the mandatory building control body for any building above 18 metres, so if you're proposing a new building above 18 metres or 7 stories in height, the mandatory building control body is the BSR. That includes works to existing high-rise buildings. You also have to register any existing high-rise building in England and Wales with the Building Safety Regulator, which is about sort of 75,000 of. Not only that, they are the regulator for every single building control body in the country and in Wales, so local authorities and private equivalents. And not only that, they are the regulator for every single individual building control professional, what's known as a registered building inspector, up and down the country in England and Wales. So their remit is huge. They're a subsidiary of the HSE, they're relatively new, but in terms of their content, they've got a huge role. So that one thing I would say regarding, well, I've said a number of things, but another thing I would say regarding the Building Safety Act itself is the key components of it, what it all means in reality, is still being thrashed out. The case law that's being established by the judiciary when these elements go into court under the Building Safety Act, and determinations are being made by lawyers, by judges regarding what it actually means. So although the Building Safety Act is still in its infancy, over the next coming years and decades, determinations regarding what it all means will come into force. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty, but specifically regarding the building regulations, there is a hell of a lot that we do know. So, if you'll humour me for a second, by show of hands, who thinks that a building control final certificate or completion certificate, if you're working with a local authority, proves compliance to the building regulations? There we go. A very experienced group, obviously. Just bear that question in mind as we run through the entirety, because that's really what many people are concerned with, these changes, is where the liability lies. And that kind of, we can explore what that all means. So, building regulations. Section 2A of the building regulations was formed by an amendment that came into force from the 1st of October 2023. So bearing in mind now we're over a year into these provisions. So any application, whether that's local authority or private building control, that is made is subject to these requirements. The first thing to say is that these are procedural changes. They're not technical changes. So it's not like changes to U values that you would need to have or changes to approved document B relating to fire safety. These are procedural changes, so not technical changes themselves. Just to give an indication that it was laid before Parliament on the 17th of August and came into force from the 1st of October. So just over 5.5 weeks that they gave us to kind of completely change the way we operate our policies and processes, which was an interesting time. So when we're looking at the building regulations, as I said, there is a lot that is uncertain, but there is a lot that we do know. And quite a lot of the answers that is often raised when I speak to architects, developers, builders, homeowners, and similar can be found in these definitions at the front. Now, apologies, legislation is dry. I will try and make it as interesting as possible, but it is what it is. Another thing I would say, using business as an example to start off with, really doesn't matter what I think a business is or what you think a business is. It is what the legislation says. Not only that, it's not what another piece of legislation says a business is. For the purposes of the building regulations, a business means a trade, business, or other undertaking, whether for profit or not. So there's no reference to whether it's a construction-related business at all, or relevant business, so to speak. A client means any person for whom a project is carried out. And then there's a subsection of client, which is a domestic client. It means a client for whom a project is being carried out, which is not in the course or furtherance of a business of that client. Again, why business is really important. Because if they're operating for the purposes of business, they are a client and not a domestic client. And that has really big implications in terms of their duties, their roles, and their associated responsibilities. Design work means design of any building work. Now that means, I know a number of surveyors in the room, for example, what you need to look at in terms of building regulations, that regulation free, if you are making suggestions that result in a change which meet the requirements of regulation free, so extension, new dwelling, material alteration, change to a thermal element, all those sorts of things, you are undertaking design work. And therefore you have the associated responsibilities as a designer and potentially a principal designer. We'll come to that later. Designer means any person who in the course of a business carries out design work or arranges for or instructs any person under their control to do so. That's a really important point as well. So if you're instructing other people to do design work, whether it's a specialist structural engineer or similar, waterproofing contractor, CSSW surveyor or whatever, then you are also a designer because you've instructed that person to undertake design work. We'll come to that in terms of competence later on. The principal contractor and principal designer means those individuals appointed under Regulation 11D. Ultimately, that just means if you've been appointed under a specific regulation. Now, the first thing to say is that, not the first thing, one thing to say on this is that these titles, these duty holder titles, although they're exactly the same as the CDM regs 2015, there is no interaction with them whatsoever. So a lot of confusion has come about because people think that these roles and responsibilities are exactly the same. There is no interaction at all. CDM is relating to construction, design and management of the build. You guys know much more about CDM than I do. I know very little / any of it. Building regulations, duty holders, are these, and this is relating to compliance to the building regulations, not relating to the role of that building as it takes place, that construction project, so to speak. Any questions on that at all so far? So, I mean, when these changes came into force, they said they were making things simpler by using the same terminology as the CDM regs. Obviously, they made things significantly more complicated. But there you go. Yeah, question?
Just one, not so much a question, just
yeah,
a quick check. So, taking on design responsibility can be as simple as saying to the client, you know, maybe that's not the best stuff to use there, perhaps you use something else there, and by suggesting that, you may well be treading on that fine line of taking on some design responsibility for that suggestion in that particular change.
So there's a few things just to unpick there. The first thing is legislation is very black and white, it just is. So under Regulation 3, if you are designing an extension, a material alteration, and that's within the legislation itself, a renovation of a thermal element or material alteration, if you are giving advice relating to those elements, that is building work, and therefore if we go back to that, design works means design of any building work. So to give an example, and this was where contractors often get caught out potentially or accruing liability without being aware of it. Design work is not just putting pen to paper or just putting lines on AutoCAD. It's not. Design work is deciding on the type of insulation you put within an external water construction. It's the size of the roof timbers that you're designing for a flat roof extension. That is design work. They are making a design decision. I'll come to exactly the role of building control later, but to give an example, digging a trench at a certain depth, whoever dug that trench, if they've not been told to do so by a structural engineer or an architect or you guys, for example, they've decided to stop digging at that certain depth, that is design work. So from a surveying point of view, if you're giving advice relating to controllable elements, then that is design work, and then that has associated implications.
Which by default can have an effect on your PI and everything else all done.
Exactly. So really important to understand what is building work under Regulation 3, basically.
Sorry, does that, say if you ask a plumber comes in to change a boiler?
Yep.
Does that?
Well, using that example, I would expect that plumber to be Ofsted registered, and that's under the competent person scheme. So he is in essence providing a completion certificate at the end of it, which meets the requirements of the building regulations. So his final certificate, albeit slightly different, but that certificate that he would provide would be proof of compliance to the building regulations themselves. Slightly different for a competent person scheme because they're offset in the schedule.
Wouldn't you still be a designer because you've instructed him?
Well, if it's for a competent person scheme, the responsibilities, i.e. these requirements relating to 2A, Part 2A, the building regulations, don't apply to competent person schemes under Schedule 3. All right. There's still a responsibility under that competent scheme, person scheme, for people to be competent and to undertake works that are fully compliant, etc., etc., etc. But these requirements relating to principal contractor, principal designer, etc., etc., do not apply.
You will use the specifics.
Sorry, Sig?
If you will use on that case,
Yep.
specific what to use, plumber will actually do it.
Yeah.
That you will be still designer.
I didn't understand.
If you will do specifics like this kind of boiler, this kind of this, then you will become designer.
Well,
if you just signing off, manual job.
Well, I think it needs to be.
Manual
I think it
design.
needs to be clear from the offset exactly what instruction you're giving him to do, and that's a contractual arrangement between yourself and that member of the competent person scheme. I would suggest that any contract documentation you have with them details the need that they install things in accordance with all relevant requirements, because then that's under the CPS scheme Schedule 3. So yeah.
For an architect, obviously, administrator quite a lot of complex.
Yes.
I'd always, well, for decades, always, if you instruct something like mechanical works or something like that, I'd always say the design you take over the design responsibility of this element, so you can package. You package the responsibilities.
So I'll come to that next in terms of exactly what the role of the principal designer is relating to the subdivision of design work, because that's really important. So just linking back into client and domestic client. So the client responsibilities, 11A1, a client must make suitable arrangements for planning, managing and monitoring project, including allocation of sufficient time and other resources. So as we said, a client, basically a developer that's building 20 new houses, they are a client and they have overall responsibility to ensure the works comply to the functional requirements. Makes sense. Domestic client, Mrs. Miggins, who's doing a single story extension as a domestic client, the understanding, whether rightly or wrongly, is that they do not have the necessary competence to be able to undertake this role over the top here. And therefore, for a domestic client, there's an element of protection that they're afforded under the legislation, which is, where the client is a domestic client, the duties in regulations 11A 1-3, basically this over here, must be carried out where there's more than one contractor for a project, the principal contractor, or the principal designer, where the client and the principal designer agree in writing. Now, the reason I've gone to B there is because it's only really the simplest of projects that there's only ever going to be one contractor. Go back to what the definition of a contractor is, any person who's carrying out building work. So the vast majority of projects will have more than one contractor, and therefore the vast majority of projects for the default position for a domestic client, the principal contractor will be responsible for the overall responsibility of that project to comply to the building regulations. If you're a principal designer, speaking to an architect over there, you have to agree in writing if you want to take on that responsibility. Now, that initial agreement does not remove your responsibilities as PD and PC, which we'll come to later. This point here is really important as well. If a domestic client fails to make the appointments required by Regulation 11D, basically telling you if you are PD or PC, the designer in control of the design phase of the project is the principal designer. And the contractor in control of the construction phase of the project is the principal contractor. So by default, if you're in charge of that element, design or construction, you are PD, you are PC for a domestic client, whether you like it or not.
So the principal contractor, would they be responsible for contractors that they aren't even involved with?
I'll come to that shortly, if that's okay. No, it's a very good question. And I think that very much interlinks in terms of that third-party element for designers as well.
Because I mean, sometimes you get a domestic client to say, give the project to a builder or the main contractor, but you say, oh, I want to use my own plumber, I've used it for years.
Yeah.
I'll do my plumbing separately, you know. That's what
Let me come to that. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And then if I haven't answered it, then just raise it with me. So what I've done here, and after this, I'll distribute the relevant legislation to JJ and he can send it out to everyone as well. But please do, I know it's very dry legislation, but it's important. This is the law. So, and the things relating to principal contractor and principal designer are only a page and a half. So it's not going to take too much of your time, but it's worthwhile reading. What I've done is extracted some key components of it to get an understanding. This is relating to principal designers. So, number one, you have a responsibility to plan, manage and monitor to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. Take all reasonable steps. This is the terminology that's repeated again and again and again. Designer in control of the design phase of the project is the principal designer, as we talked about, for a domestic client. The client can certify in writing that principal designer under CDM is principal designer for the building regulations. That's the only interaction with CDM whatsoever, even though it's the same terminology. Appointments must be made before the construction phase begins, which makes sense because if they are starting work, then a design must have happened, going back to what design is. And if they've started that work, i.e. as a contractor, then they are PD by default anyway. If principal designer is not an individual, then the designer must designate an individual to complete the functions as principal designer. So your architectural practice over there, if you had 5 people working with you in that practice, one individual within that practice needs to be listed as the principal designer. Competence, I haven't really mentioned this yet, but it's the entirety of the reason why all this stuff has happened. So you must not act as principal designer, or principal contractor we'll come to shortly, unless you are competent to undertake the work that you're being asked to do. And the same relates to designers and contractors. I see your hand in 2 seconds. Competence under legislation is skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Now that's a very ephemeral, high-level element. And there's a couple of PAS documents that are available that have dug into it a bit more, which in time will become British standards. But I think in terms of if you've got experience and knowledge and skills in relating to an element of work that you're designing, or as a contractor building, then you have proven competence. But it's all about having that proven competence. Using a structural engineer as an example, then if a structural engineer is a member of the Institute of Structural Engineers, full member, chartered member, or a member of the Institute of Civil Engineers, you would say that they have proven competence. If it's somebody that's downloaded a software package and is having a go, then clearly they do not have proven competence. Sorry, there was a question over there.
So if you're competent to take out an inspection, but not to carry out the reinstatement works, where does that leave you in the PD and the do you know what I'm saying?
No, sorry. Good.
So if I'm inspecting a fire risk assessment, for example, the easiest one for me to put out about.
Yep.
If you find something that needs doing,
yep,
you can't do the installation of the works that are required.
Yep.
How do you get away from being the PD in that? So
well, so fire risk assessments so fire risk assessments, they're undergoing a huge... Are you a fire risk assessor? Is that what you're asking about? Yeah. So they're undergoing a huge change in terms of legislation themselves, which I'm sure you're aware of. Now, in terms of the fire risk assessment that you're providing, there's a huge amounts of guidance that have been produced by the FPA, IFE and similar in terms of how you operate. When you're instructing people to do things, you need to back up what you're instructing them to do in terms of the relevant legislation. If it is controllable work, then you do get dragged into that element, potentially, that you're under the class of a PD or similar. Now, what I would say is, under a fire risk assessment, generally, you will make, when I've seen many of them, which I have, you will make recommendations, and then if it's an existing building, perhaps, that would then go to an architect or a contractor to undertake that work. I think the key component, when I'm talking about, I don't know if I mentioned it, so I don't know if anyone's a Guardian reader, for example. When Grenfell Tower happened, there was the Guardian produced something known as the Weather Blame, which was sort of 25 stakeholders associated with Grenfell, all pointing at each other, saying it was his fault, I wasn't aware of this, X, Y, and Z. The entirety of this legislation, as I said before, is to remove that ambiguity. So if you are not willing to take on that PD role, then you should inform the client that the person undertaking that role is the next person, i.e. this is my role at an end, etc., etc., etc. So it's all about being clear to everyone involved with the project who is taking on each role throughout every single period of time. So in terms of a fire risk assessor, I think you should make it clear, and I know, as I said, FPA, IFE are doing some really good work on this, and Grenfell have also made some recommendations in the Phase 2 report regarding fire risk assessors about where your remit stops and whether that is design work or not. And that, I would suggest, gives you protection under these elements themselves. Does that make sense? Yes?
I'm assuming that at the end of the day, at any stage, if someone's got a problem, there's a construction project or whatever it may be, and there's an issue, they'll just go back to the audit trail. What decisions were made, and it's all about auditing everything all the way through.
Yeah, I think so. So what I talked about is any single decision that's made,
yep,
the ability for people to have ambiguity if something results in a defect that results in a claim is reduced significantly. And I'll come to why shortly, if that's okay. So we talked about competence, talked about the PAS documents themselves. Now, if we go into the duties themselves, as principal designer, you must cooperate with the client, PD, principal contractor, principal design, to ensure that the design, if the building work to which the design relates were built, would be in compliance with all relevant requirements. Now, going back to your point regarding subsections of other designers, for example, if you're an architect and you're engaging with a structural engineer, you have a responsibility for that principal designer role to assess the competence of the person that you're appointing. That person that you're appointing as a designer should not act unless they're competent to do the works that they're being asked to do. So there's a double knock, in essence, relating to competence, to proven competence. Now, the design that they've created, you have a responsibility as PD to incorporate that design into the overarching design so that it would comply with all relevant requirements. Plan, manage, and monitor, communicate with all relevant duty holders. Their design that they've created, this is an element that often gets raised by architects. If you're appointing a structural engineer, yes, you have a responsibility to incorporate that design and to assess their competence and similar, but you're not a structural engineer. The understanding is that you for example, you don't know Young's modulus and bending moments and similar and similar. That's the role of a structural engineer. But you should be competent enough to be able to assess and incorporate that design into the overarching design so that it still complies with all the relevant requirements. Using a real-life example, structural engineer designs a beam in the cavity, causes moisture issues and thermal bridging. We see it all the time. It should have been your role. Firstly, the structural engineer should have designed it so it complied to all the relevant requirements, not just part A, but also part C and part L. But it would have been your role to incorporate that design and identify the fact that this design that you've done doesn't meet the functional requirements because of issues relating to part C and part L, basically. Does that make sense? This number 2 is a really important one. A designer must not start the design work unless satisfied that the client is aware of the duties owed by the client for the building work to which the design relates under all relevant requirements. So if you're a designer, and going back to some surveyors out there, if you're designing building works, you should not undertake that role unless the client is aware of their responsibilities before you do anything. And the same with a contractor as well. You must ensure that all designers cooperate with all other duty holders. You must liaise with the principal contractor and share any information relating planning, management, and monitoring the project to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. And if requested, the principal designer must assist the client in providing information to other designers and clients. This number 6 is really important as well in terms of how we operate within the construction industry. So with it, when the PD appointment ends, no later than 28 days after that end, you must give a document to the client explaining the duties and what you would have done under the duties 11M 1 to 3. 11M 1 to 3, these ones here. So cooperation with all duty holders, plan, manage, monitor, communicate, etc., etc., etc. So if your appointment comes to an end as a designer, as a principal designer, sorry, as an architect, normally when you've gone to a building control body, perhaps, and you've got referral back saying all looks okay, it gets to the construction phase, the client doesn't want you to be involved anymore, then you should have explained to them what you would have done if you had been retained throughout the entirety of the project itself. No later than 28 days. And the reason that's important is that if you have design elements that are outstanding, for example, you detail what you would have done if you had been retained as PD. Using the example, architects creates a design package, engages with a structural engineer, assesses the competence of that engineer, they're competent, we're competent, incorporates that engineer's design into the overarching design. Contractor goes to site, says, I've got my own structural engineer, he's much, much better, it's going to save me loads of money, who turns out not to be very competent at all. If you've been halted as PD, then it would be important to say that you would have, any further design, you would have incorporated that design within the overarching design and assessed any person's undertaking design work. And if somebody else is undertaking the PD role, then obviously they have that responsibility as well. But again, it goes back to that removing of the ambiguous nature. As the project progresses, it is clear who's PD, who's PC throughout the entirety. Again, I didn't write it, I'm just explaining what it means. Yes?
So using that example,
Yeah.
but if you've stopped being the PD and the contractor brings in a new structural engineer
Yes.
to change the design, so
Yeah.
technically isn't he now taken over the mantle of the PD?
Well, he wouldn't necessarily take over the mantle of the PD. So the only thing I would say is, so you're PD for, using domestic client as an example.
Yeah.
So you're automatically PD because you're in charge of the design phase of the project. You go to the client, I can be PD for the entirety. Client says, no, you're far too expensive. Your role is at an end. You go, fine, this is what I would have done. Brilliant. PC takes over. Now go back to the point that the principal contractor has overall responsibility for a domestic client situation. So that he then engages with a structural engineer. He becomes a designer because he's instructed a structural engineer. The structural engineer is also a designer. So they both have the necessary competence to check and et cetera, et cetera. What the legislation says is that you should appoint another duty holder, PD in this instance, as soon as reasonably practicable. It's not particularly clear what that means. Reasonably practicable for a very simple project, and there's no more design work, you would suggest perhaps there doesn't need to be a PD towards the last 2 weeks when they're just doing decorating, for example. But what the legislation is hinting at is that there should be a PD and a PC throughout the construction phase, and throughout the entirety of the project, all the way through to the end. That's what it's indicating. It's not particularly clear.
But yeah, but that doesn't happen, does it? I mean, the small domestic things where, as you say, Mrs. Miggins, to use her...
She gets named a lot.
She gets named a lot. Small single-storey extensions.
Yes.
They never want to pay for any, for the principal designer to stay on.
Yeah.
Or rarely would.
Exactly. So on that instance, what we recommend is that, so again, this is all about removing the ambiguity, right? So in architectural practice, we say, well, ultimately, any design should have been done by now.
Yeah.
Now, if there's any future design, then you should really talk to your previous PD and say, are you willing to be PD again to incorporate that future design? Or whoever's instructing that design should take on that mantle as PD for during that phase of the element itself. But it's very difficult because the legislation is not particularly clear.
And most small builders doing small extensions
Exactly.
have no idea. I mean, they probably don't.
And this is where I'm going back. This is where I'm going back to this element that the overall responsibility for the entirety for a domestic client really links back to a principal contractor, and this is why contractors are accruing a large amount of liability and not being aware of it. Yes, sorry.
Just almost as a follow-on to that one.
Yep.
You have the extension being put on the house, they get a contractor in, the contractor is then sort of not necessarily building to the design, he's making tweaks.
Yes.
He thinks he should be doing.
Yeah.
And then the client comes back and instead says, oh, can you just come and have an overlook, see what's going on?
Yeah. So there's a really interesting point there, because firstly to say those tweaks that he's making is design, and therefore and in terms of liability, I appreciate it's particularly scary when we're asking in terms of what liability means and the compliance declaration at the end. But in terms of liability, I don't think a huge amount has changed, other than the fact, basically, you make a decision, it goes wrong, you're liable for that decision. And that's the same if you make a design decision or a contractor, you're building something. But a contractor who makes a design decision, using my example before, he decides to install 6x2 flat roof joists rather than 7x2s that were on the structural engineer's drawings. He's made a design decision to specify that smaller size. Now, and which means he has the associated responsibility. Now, using your example, you're getting dragged back into a situation that you've resigned as PD, for example. Then I think it's important for you to explain to the client, even if it's a domestic client, that you aren't PD at the moment. I can be PD, but I need to be appointed, and this is what needs to happen. Because at the moment, I'm seeing things that I'm not happy with. I don't feel like I'm going to be able to fulfill my role as just coming around to have a look at things or similar. And if you want me to be PD again, then you need to appoint me, and we need to go through the process. That's, I think, the importance. So the ambiguity, again, is gone. You are PD, again, because you're being asked to come back and return. Now, if you're being retained as PD, the question is often... Sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah.
So, and the one thing I would say... I say a number of things. The other thing I would say is that if you're being retained as PD during the construction phase, the question is often asked, do we need to complete site visits? And go back to these points in terms of plan, manage and monitor coordination of building work to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. So it doesn't say thou shalt go to site as a PD on every week, every 2 weeks or whatever. What it says is you need to be confident that you've planned, managed and monitored, you communicated, cooperated with all duty holders to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. So how you achieve that is down to you to justify in the event of something going wrong, basically. Any question? Yes?
So I'm a structural engineer, but I just do very basic elements of, so like knock-through extensions, rear extensions, those sort of, sometimes, well, most of the time without an architect.
Yep.
But they will, the builder will inevitably, they'll make design choices. But I don't want to be a principal designer. but is there a way, how would you, what can I do to inform the customer that the contractor will be the designer for, I will design the structural elements, but the contractor will be designing the other elements?
So the few things to unpick. When you make a design decision, you need to comply with the entirety of the building regulations, not just Part A. So if, using an example, if you've designed a beam, structural engineers often ask me this, if you've designed a beam to create an open plan arrangement on the ground floor of a 3-storey dwelling, and you've not considered B, Part B in terms of fire safety, clearly you're not creating a design which would comply with all the relevant requirements at the end. Now, if you do not want to be PD, then you need to explain that to the client, and you need to, as we talked about, you need to explain what their duties are under the relevant requirements before you start that design work. So I would recommend you include that element. I will not be PD, you need to appoint another PD. Then it's up to the client, whoever they want to appoint, under that responsibility, whether that's a contractor, whether it's a clerk of works, whether it's a general practice surveyor, whoever, to undertake that role as principal designer. They can still appoint somebody, but by default, if you're in charge of a design work, for a domestic client, you are the principal designer.
If you don't notify them.
Well, the appointment should be made by the domestic client for another person to be PD. So if another individual has not been notified, another person is not acting as principal designer, then by default you are the principal designer if you're in charge of the design phase of the project. Now the question would be asked how this would work in terms of contract law and against these building regulations that have come into force. We don't know. This is one of the elements that will clearly be thrashed out in terms of case law that's being identified as things go to the courts.
So at the moment I say in my email that I'll be acting as a designer, not principal designer, and I inform them about the law and that they should look up on it. Is that enough for me to be covered?
I wouldn't say so, no. I think that I think the reality is that if nobody else is appointed under Regulation 11D, if you're the designer in charge of the design phase of the project, you are the principal designer. Now, the domestic client can make other appointments that can be whoever they want it to be, and that person should be competent to undertake that role. But unless they've made that appointment, then you're in charge of the design phase, and I suspect that if something were to go wrong and get looked into, you would be allocated as the principal designer. I don't know, I'm just making a judgment in terms of the legislation. That's as it's written.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because domestic clients just want to pay you as a structural engineer to just design a beam.
Yeah.
And then they want to appoint their contractor.
So on the simplest of project, the principal contractor could take on that role as PD if they wanted to. But everyone should be aware who's doing what role at each and every time.
So does the principal designer have to ensure that the contractor is?
So, we'll come to that in a bit. Sorry, JJ's looking at me because I'm running over time. I do apologise. We'll come to that exactly what you sign, and this goes back to the compliance declaration at the end of the project, which is really, really important in terms of what you do and what you don't do. Yes, sorry.
Could our friend the structural engineer not just say that he's not competent to take on the role of...
If he's not competent to take on the role as principal designer, then he shouldn't act as principal designer. But bearing in mind that you are by default the principal designer for a domestic client if you're in charge of the design phase of the project. Yeah. So I don't mean speaking in tongues at all, but that's just what the legislation says. So that's the reality. Again, I didn't write it. Sorry, yeah.
I'm just thinking about our friend here as well. He's saying you need to appoint someone else as principal designer.
Yep.
Because he doesn't have to check that person.
Well, the point he would, if he's not principal designer, he doesn't have a responsibility to check on the competence of another designer. No. But the point I would make is in terms of your, sorry, I didn't catch your name. Andrew. The point in terms, well, I'll chat later as well, I'm more than happy to do so. But as a structural engineer, if you're in charge of a design phase of the project, you are PD by default. Now, the client can make other decisions, and it may well be in the event of it going to law or something that the decisions regarding the design phase could be adjudged to be the contractor because they made those decisions as the design continued. I don't know. What the legislation says that if you're in charge of the design phase, you are PD by default, unless another appointment is made.
So if can I get them to confirm that they will someone else will take this duty and not myself? How do I do a contract?
I think it's difficult, and I think I would engage with, iStructD are doing some really good work on this in terms of contract documents that protects users like yourself and individuals like yourself. I would liaise with my charter body in terms of those contract documents that they've used, and your insurers as well.
Sorry.
No, you're right. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I spent some time working for Mace as a senior project manager.
Yes.
And they were almost insane about making sure that we never took on design responsibility.
Yep.
This is in the commercial world, and so domestic things slightly different. You can see that it's heading in that direction.
Yep.
So the original designer would have to be novated over to the ongoing design team to make sure that there is a line of responsibility and there's an audit trail.
Yes.
And they were absolutely insane about making sure that you did that. And they would be novated over, and you would have to make sure that they were fully compliant and fully ready. It seems, and the domestic rules and regulations are heading in that direction.
I think there's a few things to say. So JCT contracts haven't been updated to include the Building Safety Act changes, which is really, really difficult, or the NSs. So that's difficult. I don't profess to be an expert, but I'm aware that's the case. As I said before, in the event of any decision that results in a defect, that results in a claim, the idea is there's no ambiguity of who was responsible when that decision was made. That's where we are. That's what they're trying to achieve.
Because we're looking at corporate manslaughter, and that's where they're heading in the end.
Is there a duty on the contractor? You talk about tweaks and changes. Is there a duty on them to record when those changes are made then?
So,
because that's part of the trail, isn't it? Because if you get a joist or timber joist or a steel beam change and it collapses, we're all in court working out who made the change.
And so, going back to the principal contractor, and the reason why that I've duplicated because they are exactly the same, other than the fact that the principal contractor's responsibilities are regarding the build rather than the design itself. The only variation is, and in terms of what you're talking about, if you've made a variation, for example, they have a responsibility to cooperate with all other duty holders, principal designer, client, domestic client, etc., etc. They must respond and ensure planning, manage and monitoring, etc., etc., etc. So if they've made a design decision under those requirements, they should have informed everybody about what these were. The addition to this that I would say, the way that I interpret this legislation is that a principal contractor not only has a responsibility, has the same responsibilities as principal designer, but going back to that domestic client bit, a principal contractor just saying we followed the drawings, I don't think would be sufficient justification, because they must ensure, to the extent necessary, that the work is compliant with all relevant requirements. So if a designer has designed an installation which doesn't comply for whatever reason, it's been missed, it carries all the way through, and then it results in a defect, it results in a claim, I don't think an adequate response of the principal contractor would say it's as per the drawings. It doesn't work like that. It's never worked like that. Ultimately, there would be liability split in terms of if it goes to case law and a judge, but the contractor would have an inherent element of liability, associated responsibility, because it was their responsibility to assess whether the design would also comply and build it in accordance with the building regulations. Does that make sense? And this has always been the case. It's just that it's been crystallised within the legislation itself. Any questions on that?
I just say, am I oversimplifying it by saying, in essence, this is all about making sure that at any stage, it's patently clear who's responsible.
That's it.
Who sits where.
Yes.
And that's documented.
Exactly. That's it.
The bottom line?
That's pretty much it.
Oh, well.
I'll go. To the better. Yeah, go.
Like hyperventilating.
Would it help to define when a project has to comply with the building regs? Because I think it used to be like a porch.
Yes.
Too small.
Well, so there's
I think you can also say an example on behalf of my surveyor friend.
Yep.
Because I'm a structural engineer.
Yes.
So say if you're replacing a flat roof,
yep.
Flat roof's leaking, you say you got a new flat roof.
Yep.
If it's felt and chippings, and you're going to put felt and chippings back, that's just a repair. So that doesn't require building regulations.
Yes,
it doesn't come into the building regulations. But if you say, well, let's not put felt back, let's put this other fancy new material.
Yeah.
Does that then?
Well, there's a number of nuances that I would say regarding that in terms of when building regulations apply. And so in Schedule 2, there's a number of exempt elements. So porches, conservatories if they're of a certain size, small outbuildings if they don't have sleeping accommodation, all of that is listed within the legislation itself about what doesn't require building regulations. Using your example, replacement of thermal elements, then Often, yes, that does require application of the building regulations because it's renovation of a thermal element, more than 50%. If you're doing that, then you need to meet the threshold values, which is in table 4.3 of ADL. So you do need to consider that in some instances. Early engagement with the building control body in terms of what you need to adhere to is sensible, but also if you're designing that element of work, then you should be competent to do it and know what the requirements are when you're speaking to your building control body. Yes, you're right, there are huge elements of works regarding some things that surveyors do which aren't subject to the building regulations, but there are quite a lot, obviously, which do. Have a look in Regulation 3 of the building regulations, have a look at the Schedule 2, which is the exempt structures, related to porches, conservatories, and similar. So that's principal contractor requirements, as I said, which we've done. So, how am I doing for time? Sorry, I know I'm running on.
Plenty of time.
You sure? So, these were the changes to the approved inspector regulations that came in from the 1st of October last year. And you may well have heard these 3 documents that are being requested by building control bodies as you interact with them throughout the design and construction phase of the project. It's no mistake that these changes came in at exactly the same time as the changes to the building regulations. The two are intrinsically linked. So, the first one is relatively simple. Basically, when you are appointed as a duty holder, or in a domestic client situation, when you take on that role automatically, you should notify the building control body within 14 days of your appointment. So all we need to know, this is a form that I produced, which we've got an online website. We need name, address, telephone number, etc., etc. As I said, if it's an organisation, then it needs to be the individual within that organisation that is taking on that role. If the PD changes or the PC changes, then we need to know within 14 days of the new appointment itself. So, next one is a commencement notice. This doesn't really have any interlink to Grenfell itself, but it was a change of legislation that came in at the same time. So commencement now has a legal definition under the building regulations, which prior it didn't. And commencement, what people think is commencement, is actually now further on down the line. So there's 3 different types of commencement. There's complex, which is a public building, more than 100 people, 2 basements and similar, or a podium deck. And commencement for that is when the lowest most ground floor structure is complete. So we're looking raft, block and beam, oversight, or similar. Non-complex, which is anything that's not complex. The way they write this is really good, isn't it? So that is, again, when the lowest most ground floor structure is complete. So, and then there's other, when there's not a change of footprint. So we're talking barn conversions, loft conversions, garage conversions, and similar. And that commencement is when 15% of the work is complete. Now, the reason that's important is if you don't reach that stage of commencement, then the initial notice or the full plans application lapses, and you need to reapply for building control, which means that the relevant sections of the building regulations would apply to that new application. So we've got changes to the building regulations coming in next year, future home standards. We had changes to the building regulations a couple of years ago regarding FLOSS, changes to ventilation, energy and overheating and infrastructure for charging vehicles. So future changes, basically you need to be further down the piece to be able to lock in that section of the building regulations themselves. Now, a question that's often asked regarding from architects is whether that commencement interlinks with the planning legislation in terms of locking in planning, for example, for 2 years or whatever. Planning legislation and building regulations have no interaction whatsoever. So we go out and we inspect, well, one of my staff goes and inspects a trench, for a foundation. We would list it as foundations inspection, excavations inspection. Now, normally, the local authority planning department will accept that document as notification that you have started. But if any architects out there or people that are looking after projects, it'd be worthwhile engaging with your local authority planning department to ascertain what they will accept as they term it, I think, a meaningful start. You guys know better than I do in terms of So what we do as an organisation, we send out prompts to our clients to say, we believe you've reached commencement at this stage, which, as I said, is oversight normally, or when 15% work is complete, and ask them to provide this form and send it back to us. And that's, as I talked about, the different types of commencement and when that date of commencement is reached. The last bit, which is kind of all what we talked about before, comes to a head, because this is the compliance declaration. So, if you've made a building control application, whether a local authority or private equivalent, any duty holder that's been appointed and the client, including a domestic client, needs to sign a compliance declaration at the end of the project to enable us to issue the final certificate or the completion certificate. So, what the client says is that the works, to the best of their knowledge, comply with the functional requirements of the building regulations. And what a principal designer says is that they've complied to Part 2A of the building regulations, duty holders and competence, which is exactly what we talked about over here. So at the end of the project, you need to sign, if you've acted as a duty holder, a compliance declaration to confirm that you've acted in accordance with those requirements. Principal contractor, principal designer, client, domestic client. If there's been 2, we need 2 compliance declarations. If there's been 5, then we need 5. And the reason why no building control body, whether local authority or private, are not going to issue a final certificate or completion certificate without these statements, these compliance declarations, is that within the final certificate itself, it stipulates that we've received those compliance declarations, which, if we issued a final certificate without it, individually as an owner and a director, I would have falsified a document, a legal document, which I'm not going to do. Any questions on that at all? It's kind of where it all comes to a head, basically. Why all of the other stuff I've talked about is important. Good.
So, sorry.
No, you're right.
So the principal designer, you can have the builder sign that off then?
Sorry, say again.
You can have the contractor or builder sign the principal designer off?
Well, it wouldn't be, it's not the role of the building control body to ascertain who is undertaking which role. So if we've been notified, which we should have been within 14 days of the appointment of PD, we need a compliance declaration for that PD at the end. That can be any individual. Obviously, they need to take their own assessment to determine whether they're competent to undertake that role or not.
Can the client sign that?
A client can, is my interpretation, again, if we go back to the definitions. A client means any person, including the client, but not a domestic client. A contractor, sorry, it means any person, including the client, but not a domestic client, who in the course of a business carries out, manages, and controls any building work. So a contractor cannot be a domestic client. So a domestic client cannot be a contractor.
Can a PD be client?
No.
Domestic client?
So again, my interpretation, others interpret it differently. A designer means any person, including a client, contractor, or other person referred to, who in the course of a business carries out design work. And if we go back to the course of a business, business means a trade business or other undertaking. If they're undertaking for the course of a business, they are a client and not a domestic client. So therefore, if they are a domestic client, they cannot be principal designer. Yes?
With this whole start and appointment of PD,
Yep.
is that the time when the client is thinking about it, says, not the action plans, let's have a look at it, let's get some costings in, see if I can afford it? Or is that the start, or is it when you've actually got to a stage when you've appointed a contractor and start?
So it's a really good question. It goes back to what design is. So the notification of duty holder is within 14 days of appointment. What does appointment mean? We don't know. They didn't stipulate it. But bearing in mind that we know what design is for building work, and therefore is meeting the functional requirements of the building regulations. So planning drawings, for example, under this interpretation, because it's not relating to building work, which is defined in Reg 3, as we talked about, planning drawings is not design work for the purposes of the building regulations. This is my interpretation at least. And therefore, when you start construction drawings to meet the functional requirements of Schedule 1 in the building regulations, that is design work, and that is when you should notify your building control body within 14 days of your appointment.
Or even for domestic clients?
Even for domestic.
So, structural designer doing some structural design work.
Yep.
So it's got to notify.
No, this is relating to PDs. So again, going back to that point of talking about designers and PDs, the PD, when they're appointed, should notify us within 14 days.
They are by default, aren't they, on domestic?
But they should notify the building control body. That's the point I'm making.
They should. So
yes.
As soon as the client contacts you,
when you start the construction, within 14 days of your appointment. So as soon as you started that construction phase drawing, so to speak, REBA stages, I can't remember which ones they are.
Construction, if we do it,
So it's when you start design work for the purposes of building regulations, basically. You need to notify the building control body, which means, sorry, I'll come to you in a second. So for example, on a normal project, the way that we operate is we'll get a quote out for our building control services. They'll say, yes, we'll go with you, or no, we won't, or whatever. So if they go with us and we get a full set of construction drawings, at that stage, we would say we believe that you've been appointed as principal designer, in which case, please complete this form. That's how we operate. Now you should, once that appointment had been made, notify us within 14 days of that appointment. What I think that legislation is trying to do is bring back the engagement with the building control body to earlier on in the piece, because I think it's important to engage with us as soon as you possibly can. But that being said, that 14 days is within appointment. Sorry, yes.
What was that 2 days notice that I saw on the screen?
Yeah, sorry. So, yeah, when work start, we need to be notified within 2 working days.
What's when work start?
Work starting is what we used to think commence was. So, pulling a trench, a foundation or similar. It's a permanent placement of controllable works. So using the example, so for an extension, that would be pulling a foundation. For internal alterations, that would be putting a steel beam in. That's when that's starting works.
Can I do that retrospectively?
We should be notified within 2 working days. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, I mean, one of the issues we get with, again, with small domestic clients is that, you know, in terms of notifying you guys, often, you know, we wait until there's a contractor appointed. So we've done the construction drawings and design. It's gone out to tender. And then a particular contractor will say, well, actually, I'd like to use you guys, or actually, no, I'm quite happy using the local authority. So the decision as to who's going to be the building control
it's really difficult. I completely agree. No, I completely agree. That element of 14 days is really difficult. What I think it's trying to do is drag the appointment of the building control further back towards the piece, because then early engagements means that it's more likely, we'll come to what a role of building control is in a bit, but it's more likely that you end up with a compliant solution rather than justifying something that's non-compliant from the offset, basically. And that was one of the criticisms of the role of building control. So there was a question about.
My question's on a different part of the Act. I don't know if you know.
I shall try.
There's section 144 and section 145.
By me, yeah.
And what they relate to is alterations done to buildings, probably ones that need. It doesn't define what the alterations are. It's like substantial, so probably something that needs building regulation approval. But what it's saying is that those alterations, and this may be backdated to alterations from 2015, need the equivalent of a 10-year NHBC guarantee on them. Now, this part of the Act, as far as I'm aware, has not been enacted yet. But it's just around the corner, and I've heard of lenders, Virgin Money for one, that wouldn't lend on a substantially altered building that was done about 10 years ago because there was no guarantee at the time. So it was outside what would have been NHBC guarantee anyway. And that was not with an adverse survey, they just didn't want to know.
So there's a few bits to unpick with that. Yeah, that section of the Act hasn't been activated. Activate is the wrong word, but imposed, I suppose. So my understanding of that is that there is the provisions within the Act to enable NHBC to be the sole provision of warranty services for new dwellings. But that was never enacted when it was created back in 1984. That's my understanding.
I understand that you can get the equivalent of an architect's completion certificate or something to act as that thing.
The thing I would say is, again, all of these changes, and trying to focus purely on the building regulation, the Building Safety Act, as I said, huge. Not only in terms of warranty, Architects Act in 1997, Defective Premises Act, and we're not clear of entirely what the impacts of it are. It's still being thrashed out. So there are huge changes coming down the line in terms of warranty provision. We don't get involved in warranty provision. We focus purely on the building regulations element themselves. I know somebody who's very, very knowledgeable regarding warranty, which I'm happy to pass the details on if you want a bit more detail.
I think this is probably going to be really relevant to all people that do condition surveys, in the room, because I've certainly had it on my mind. How do I advise clients
in understanding
when they're buying a substantially altered thing?
Yes.
When in a couple of years' time, their marketability might be through the floor because they've got no certificate.
In terms of that warranty provision, and there has been huge changes regarding the warranty provision itself. Was there any other questions? No? Fine. So that's the compliance declaration. As I said, no building control body, private or local authority, is going to issue a fine certificate or a completion certificate without it. Now, I am aware that some building control bodies are, and they're not doing anybody any favours in terms of those provisions, because these requirements are legislation, they are law. People need to have been issued compliance declarations to comply with the relevant legislation. So if you've completed works without a compliance declaration and then something goes wrong, the first question I would suspect that would be asked is, where is your compliance declaration? Where is your notification of duty order document, etc. And that's what we try and do as an organisation, is promote public safety, which is the role of all building control bodies, but also proactively demonstrate how and ask for this information right from the offset. Try and make people aware as they engage with us all the way through. So, without further ado, a little bit of finishing off in terms of building control and how we've changed. So, at the 6th of April just gone, we are no longer approved inspectors, we are known as a registered building control approver. That wasn't just a name change, that was quite significant. So we now have to follow a whole new suite of documents that are published by the HSE, the BSR in essence. And this is the first time that local authorities have to follow the same codes and standards, professional codes and standards, that private building control bodies do. So there should be a convergence in terms of how we operate. Local authorities still have a different role in terms of enforcement and similar, but they are under the same, in the majority, standards that we are. So not only did we change as an organisation, we changed as individuals. So from the 6th of April, just gone, it is illegal for anyone to undertake building control, what's known as restricted activities, so plan checks and site inspections, unless you're registered with the government at that level for which you are being asked to undertake, dependent on the height of the building and the purpose group of the building. It's what's known as impersonating a building inspector. So, who would want to do that? So what happens is, from the 6th of April, prior to the 6th of April, we had to go through a competency assessment scheme. So there was 3 elements. I was actually on the panel of one of them, and we did assess those individuals going through the process and certify them, or recommend that they're certified to that certain level, depending on the height and purpose group of the building, as I said. This is the wagon wheel in terms of competence that we are assessed against. And at the end of the process, you're registered with the government as an RBI, depending on your class. Class 1, you're only able to work under supervision. Class 2, you're able to work on these building categories over here, and you can see it's the purpose group and the height of the building itself. Class 3, that's relating to high-rise buildings, and Class 4, that's a technical manager. So myself, I'm a Class 2, A, B, and D, and a Class 4 technical manager. So, what you can do, you can type into Google, find a registered building inspector, and if you're engaging with a building control body, I think it would be prudent to ascertain the number of RBIs that they have registered within their organisation, which you can do. So, how this is all changing in terms of when you interact with building control bodies. This top line, we must have no professional or financial interest in the work that we supervise as a registered building control approver. And there's kind of been a lexicon of opinion that since Grenfell in 2017 in terms of how building control needs to change. So this was some guidance that was issued in the summer of 2023 stipulating that, so Sick Air was our old regulator as approved inspector, and now we're regulated by the BSR. And they said that building control had become a quasi-design service, that we've been more like a consultant and less like a regulator. There's a huge amount of criticism regarding that. 4th of September, just gone. This was the Phase 2 Grenfell Tower report. And 113.35 over the top here stipulated that regarded building controllers primarily as a source of advice and assistance. It was even described as an extension of the design team. In many cases, that was how building control saw its role. That was a serious misunderstanding, but it was fostered by building control bodies themselves who preferred to cooperate with applicants to enable proposals to be approved rather than enforce the building regulations rigorously. In our view, that has to change. So, in terms of how we change going forward, there is a focus very much on being a regulator and not a consultant, for want of a better word. Now, there's a whole element of black and white, and there's a whole element of grey in between, isn't there? So, in terms of we cannot design for you, we cannot tell you and instruct you how to put things right. which is clearly wrong, and what potentially has happened in the past. And then there's that looks wrong, and then driving off and ignoring the situation, just saying that's wrong. Clearly, that doesn't particularly help either. And the ICC, so that's the Industry Competency Committee, produced some guidance, 11th of October just gone, talking about a problem that we come across all the time as RBIs. So this is talking about an RBI visiting. They've gone out to have a look at a trench foundation, there's clay soil, and there's trees nearby. As I talked to before, if there's no structural engineer who's designed the depth of that foundation, the contractor should be aware, whether he is or not, that he is designing the depth. By stopping digging, he's designing the depth. So in that situation, the most likely approach that we would do would be, there's clay soil, there's a tree over there, what have you considered in terms of heat precaution, chapter 4.2 and similar? Have you engaged with a structural engineer to design the depth that you should go to, for example, yourself over there? We would not be in a position, we should not have in the past, but we definitely will not be going forward, be in a position that we would go dig to 1.6 and it'll be fine. Because that is us giving design advice, and therefore we are getting dragged into that provision as a designer, which we cannot be. We are a regulator. What that kind of means is in terms of, and this is how I try and differentiate between building control, not as a consultant, and you guys as design or construction consultants. If something goes wrong with a project that results in a defect, results in a claim, there will be an associated liability, whether that's designer who's made the decision talked about before or contractor who's done something wrong. Murphy and Brentford, 1991, pretty established case law which determines that a building control body can't be financially liable for something that goes wrong. What would happen would be that financial associated would go to those who made the decision, presumably, and that would allocate in terms of liability and similar. What could potentially happen to the RBI is not financial liability, but we would be fined by the BSR and individually have restrictions put on our registration. The BSR are much, much, much more interested in terms of whether we've operated within our code of conduct as registered building inspectors, and much less interested in regarding whether defects have occurred subsequently with the project. Because, as all the legislation stipulates, that is the responsibility of those who've designed and carried out the works themselves, not the RBI or the building control body. So the last bit of I know we started with this at the start, but this paragraph at the top is actually from the Manual to the Building Regulations, was written, I think, in 2010. So this has been in place for some time. The responsibility for building in compliance with the building regulations lies with those who carry out the work. So the designers, the builders, the installers, etc. It's not the building control body's issue in terms of that responsibility. And that goes back to what I'm talking about before in terms of the legal basis of that final certificate that we issue at the end of the project. The evidence, the certificate is evidence but not conclusive evidence that the requirements specified in it have been complied with. So the responsibility still lies with those who designed and undertook the works themselves and the client or homeowner. Yes?
Saying what you're saying there,
yep.
It's been a problem. It was a problem before because
yep.
you would perhaps put something forward to building control, and building control might come back to you and say, "I'm sorry, we're not happy with that. We think you can design that better. It might be some structural element of it or whatever."
Yep.
And then you would naturally go back to building control. What is it that you're not happy with? And then they would come back to you and say, "Sorry, mate, that's for you to find out. You put it right and come back to us."
Yep.
And so you might go round this little semicircle or circle a couple of times, wasting everybody's time and everybody getting frustrated. You've got an issue with it.
Yeah.
You're not happy with an element of it,
yeah.
but it's not specifically for you to tell us what's wrong with it or to give us the solution on how to rectify it.
I'll use a few examples of how I think we should operate. So using that, I'll use two. So using that trench example, what we would do, we'd go out and say, you got clay soil, you got an oak tree over there. Have you spoken to an engineer? The contractor might go, yes, he said it's all okay. Can we provide evidence of this? Yes, we'll have a look at it. We still think it's wrong. Can you clarify this with the engineer? Engineer might go, actually, I thought it was chalk. Okay, that's how you need to go an extra 600 mil. Fine, that's all okay. But we wouldn't be instructing you how to resolve the issue. Going back to a design element itself, we need to reference the relevant guidance using fire safety as an example. We've got a new 4-storey dwelling that people are designing. Sorry, I'm going to come around because I can see you properly there. We've got a new 4-storey dwelling that people are designing, right? ADB stipulates that it needs to have an external staircase, an alternative route of escape, or a full suppression system in accordance with BS 9251. A full sprinkler system, sorry, in accordance with BS 9251. Pre-application advice, we have a meeting, we talk about it. We go, have you considered this because of the floor height above the external ground level? Designer would go, yeah, we're talking about an external staircase. We would go, okay, the external staircase, have you considered the unprotected areas abutting onto that external staircase? Because they're going to need to be fire rated and they're going to need to be fixed shut. Designer might go, didn't think about that. Can we go down a sprinkler system or a misting system? Okay, yeah, cool, send us the details across. The client doesn't like the idea of the sprinkler system, they'd rather go down a misting system because they want to save money and they've got this strange idea regarding Die Hard in terms of lighters setting the whole lot off. Now, we would go, fine. Be aware, though, that BS 9991 stipulates that a number of other provisions regarding AWFSS systems relate to a misting system in comparison to a sprinkler system. ADB doesn't actually make reference to a misting system. How are you going to comply? They go, actually, the other provisions in BS 9991 we can't achieve those because of X, Y, and Z. We want an open plan or whatever. In which case, we're going to go, fine. Sounds like you're not going to be in compliance with ADB, Volume 1. Sounds like you're not going to be in compliance with BS 9991. You need to engage with a fire engineer because you're going outside the relevant guidance. That conversation we can still have. We have not designed anything for you throughout the entirety, 5 minutes yet. We haven't designed anything for you at all. What we've done was we provided the indication of what the relevant guidance is. Now, to finish up on that point, you go off to a fire engineer. The fire engineer decides that it's all fine, and et cetera, et cetera. Just because we've had that conversation does not negate, that's the word I'm looking for, the ability for us to look at that fire engineer solution and go, we don't think it complies to B1. Please tell us how it does. So when I talk about building control and duty holders, there's a strategic context that the BSR produced, a really helpful document, and section 2.7 in there says, building control should expect duty holders and stakeholders to proactively demonstrate how they've complied to the functional requirements of the building regulations. I.e., you tell us. We're going to be talking to you about why we don't think it complies or what specific elements we want looking at. We're going to talk about the relevant guidance which says that you're varying from. You tell us how you are complying, and then we'll look at it.
But perhaps OWL as building control might be quite friendly like that and come forward and say, well, have you looked at this? Have you considered that? But not all building control
well, I think there's a
companies or all that. And particularly the council.
I think there's an element of perception, which having worked for local authorities and private companies, I think the perceptions are actually wrong, because the perception is that, you know, we'll be more helpful and local authorities won't, or whatever. But as I said, the systems themselves should converge. We're all working under the same RBI code of conduct. We should be operating in the same way. So whether I work for, where are we, Test Valley, or whether I work for OWL, I should be operating exactly the same way because it's the same code of conduct. Now, we'll have discussions about what you think, and I think the key component on that is that still having the ability to act as a regulator. We're not giving design advice, we're discussing things as an informal chat about what you might consider early on with the process. But that doesn't negate the ability for us to act as a regulator. Now, some other building control bodies act in a different way. They provide design services, consultancy services, they provide warranty services, all that sort of stuff. My opinion, it's only my opinion, is that does not meet these requirements regarding having no professional financial interest in the work they supervise. So my opinion, as owner of OWL, is that we must be independent, have no professional financial interest in the project whatsoever, and therefore we must act as a regulator and nothing more. Yes?
I mean, going back to the simple to the trench foundation, we're still getting it on small extensions where, you know, we've designed it, and, you know, maybe on the notes we've initially put to a minimum of 1 metre deep. Yep. Goes out, turns out there's good chalk down there.
Yep.
And the contractor phones up and says, oh, building control just been out, they said we can pour the foundations at 700 because we're onto good chalk. And so they've gone ahead and poured the foundations. They've informed us, but we haven't had. So
the point I would make is, again, so in terms of the role of building control, we're not a clerk of works. No. We assess whether it meets the functional requirements of Schedule 1 of the building regulations. So using that example, The RBI in question may well looked at that trench and said 550mm consistent chalk strata appears to comply to A1 to 3. Brilliant, right? It's even on your drawing says it's a metre. It's not our job to go out and go, the drawing says a metre, you should dig to a metre. That is not our job. We do not, we check against drawings, of course, particularly regarding, you know, loads of elements relating to structural elements and similar, but we are not a clerk of works. We do not check against the details of the drawings. We assess offers of compliance against the Schedule 1 of the building regulations themselves. So that is kind of an example of that.
Do you not think that's useful, someone to be doing that role? I mean, like clerk of works, because I've always thought that should be the role of the building control inspector, that they should just be purely checking the work is compliant with the drawings and spec. If it's not, then they flag it up.
I mean, clerk of works, I completely agree, is a very useful role, and I think it's important, and it's massively underused. I think we could probably all agree on that, within the construction sector, but it's not building control. No. It never has been, never will be. We are purely assessing the works against the functional requirements of the building regulations themselves. Sorry, say again.
It is very hated position.
Sorry.
The notification of duty holders.
Yes.
Does that have a shelf life? Does it run out?
So, I mean, we need to know within 14 days of your appointment, basically. So, sorry, when you've come to an end. So, on the compliance declaration, there's a date of appointment. So, we would recommend that there's no legal obligation, but we would recommend when your appointment has come to an end, as PD or PC or wherever, so we can update our records. There's no legal obligation to update us. The legal obligation is to update the client. But on the compliance declaration at the end, there is 2 dates which says date of appointment, when you started and when you finished. So basically what you're doing there is saying that I was PD from, I don't know, 1st of January all the way through to the 30th of April, basically.
But there could be, looking at the project at the other end, so you're initially appointed, sometimes it's 2 years before you get to site.
Yeah, it's a really good point, yep.
So is it still valid? And you don't issue your commencement notice until 2 years' time?
So the thing I would say is that the final certificate requires a compliance declaration. We would recommend, if you're in that situation, your role is completely at an end, my recommendation would be that you issued a compliance declaration to the client or the building control body at the point that your role has come to an end as PD, because then you're putting a full stop on exactly your involvement in the project as a whole. That's what we advise. It's not within the legislation. The legislation stipulates that we need it to enable us to issue the final certificate, and we need it when the works are complete. But you can issue it earlier.
Sorry, the original question, the gap between initial appointment and work starting on site?
There's no gap between that at all, no. In terms of your date of appointment. Right. No, that can be, you could have you could have a date of appointment which was 2 years ago and the works would start on site. The only relevance to that would be if you haven't reached commencement within 3 years, as we talked about, the initial notice would lapse. Yes, sorry.
Almost as a follow-on from that, what happens when you get a job that just drags on? It's been started under, before this came into play.
Yeah.
What happens?
So this was a kind of topic for conversation from the 1st of October last year, or the 6th of April actually, sorry. The government they produced a circular that said that these would apply under transitional arrangements, but they didn't amend the legislation correctly, which meant that irrespective of the date of when the initial notice was submitted is key. So if you've submitted an initial notice prior to the 1st of October, then these don't apply. If you've submitted it after the 1st of October, these requirements do apply. That's it. The government tried to do something with a circular and didn't amend the legislation correctly. No further comment. Any other questions for me at all? I know it's a whistle-stop tour, but it sounds like I'm out of time.
Just a general point. I mean, all this makes complete sense to me as a structural engineer for bigger projects, and I think we can all understand sort of the CDM.
Yes.
And the parallels drawn.
Yes.
But in the real world, in small projects, in the old, what I call the old building notice jobs, where the builder would give you 24 hours notice for the local authority, that he's taking out a wall, he's putting in a beam, he's digging a trench, he's putting in a bit of drainage. He doesn't want any design fees, he doesn't want his client to have to incur any design fees. It'll be effectively, and I understand why the local authority shouldn't attract any design liability completely, but does that mean that we're effectively doing away with the building notice scheme and that everything's got to be designed up front in reality?
And my opinion is that there was a missed opportunity to not remove the building notice from the legislation, because in my opinion, not working for a local authority, purely my opinion, I do not see how the role of building control can operate under a building notice.
It's going to be dead in the water, isn't it?
It's very, very difficult, isn't it? Because clearly you cannot, and 3 weeks ago, sorry, the HSE, the BSR, produced a guidance note to say that we would have an unlimited fine if we stepped outside of our code of conduct.
And the foundation depth is the classic example
Exactly that.
where builders in time-honoured fashion have agreed foundation depths forever with the local authority.
Yep. Or private in the past.
And they've completely ignored the mature height of the tree one day.
Yep.
And they said, well, there's no tree roots there today, so we'll go down a metre.
In my opinion, as I said, I think it's a missed opportunity not to remove the building notice. I think I would struggle to act within my code of conduct, which is applicable to all RBIs, if I was operating under a building notice for a local authority. I think it would be very, very difficult. Obviously, we don't have to deal with that as an RBCA. We purely accept initial notices. That being said, we do have projects that don't have full plans application, and we need to make that judgment. I think it very much goes back to the point that we were talking about before, which about what design work is, design of any building work, and who has that associated liability in that instance. It's not just putting pen to paper, it's not just AutoCAD, it's making a decision. Sorry.
So just one last point, you may have covered, and I may have missed it.
No, not at all.
If I'm designing a beam,
Yep.
and I say to the client, I'm not going to be the principal designer,
Yep.
please tell me who is.
Yep.
If they don't answer that question,
Yep.
should I refuse to design the beam?
It's really difficult, isn't it? And I think that's what I was talking with Andrew, it was Andrew, wasn't it, before. It's really difficult because, as I said, for a domestic client, by default, you're in charge of, if you're in charge of the design phase of the project, by default, you are the principal designer. So the domestic client can make another appointment under Regulation 11D, but the default provision is that you're in charge of the design phase, and therefore you are the principal designer.
So if they don't reply to that question, I should refuse to do it.
I mean, it's very difficult. I would liaise with your, if you remember the Institute of Structural Engineers, I know they do some really good stuff on here. I've been on a number of panels with them as well. So I think that contract document, speak to your PI provider as well. Sorry, yeah. I know I need to go.
I was just going to say, could he not put a caveat on his, as he puts the work forward, saying, I take responsibility for the design of this single beam only, and have no responsibility for the ongoing project?
You can caveat what you like, but the point is how that caveat knocks up against the requirements of the building regulations, we're still yet to see. My guess is that if something goes wrong, particularly regarding fire safety and loss of life, which is what we should all be concerned about, that no caveat is going to be particularly relevant.
Fair enough.
That's my guess, basically. Yes?
What happens if your terms and conditions don't include you being on site?
So that goes back to the point, if you're principal designer, you're being retained as principal designer during the construction phase of the project. And I think the point goes back to, there's nothing within the legislation that says you need to visit 5 times or 4 times, depending on single story extension, 20 times if it's flats or whatever. There's nothing in there at all. But what you need to do is take reasonable steps to ensure that you are planning, managing, and monitoring the project, you're coordinating the building work, and you're liaising with all relevant duty holders. Because at the end of the project, you've got to sign your compliance declaration to say that you've done that. So you need to document what you are doing and how that meets your requirements under 11M 1 to 3 of the building regulations if you are retained as the principal designer. Now, if you have an incredibly complex project that you've designed with intricacies regarding X, Y, and Z, I would suggest that planning, managing, and monitoring, communicating, ensuring compliance with relevant requirements would include site visits. I would suggest that. If you had a very, very simple project and you had a competent structural engineer that you were aware that, you know, an installation of a steel beam that you're aware was visiting site anyway, and you got his reports, for example, I would suggest perhaps that wouldn't require site visits and under your requirements under a principal designer role. What I think is important is that you're liaising with all of the duty holders and that you're documenting what you're doing and why that meets the requirements under 11M 1 to 3. Sorry, I got lost in terms of the slides. There, 11M 1 to 3. And that's really important. Now, REBA, I know, have produced some contract documentation that if anyone's a member of REBA, REBA and also CIAT have produced their own register in terms of principal designers as well. So I have no affiliation with them whatsoever, but if I was in a principal designer role, I would be looking to engage with them because they provide and offer a level of protection regarding the contracts that you engage with in terms of these requirements themselves. Anybody else at all? I'll be available if you need me. You'll have my contact details. Feel free to drop me a line. Oh, one more, sorry.
Publish the slides.
Yes, so JJ's got a copy of the slides now.
I've got a copy of the slides. We could make them available if you're happy for us to actually send them out to people.
Yeah, it's fine. No problem.
So if you'd like a copy of the slides, you can send me an email and we'll contact you. Not everybody wants.
What I'll do, JJ, as well, is I'll send the relevant legislation, which everyone will love to read, I'm sure, which is only a few pages, which came from the 1st of October. So these are the amendment regs, so you don't need to trawl through the entirety of it.
Yeah, thank you.
JJ, couldn't you just send it to everybody and those that don't want it can just delete it?
I can, but it's more work for them.
No work for you, Jim.
We'll send it to everybody. We either set it up as a mail merge, which takes a while, and we send it to everybody. We'll do it. It actually is. But it's not a problem. We'll send it to everybody. Just to point, you're not allowed to sort of then copy it and start doing your own presentations from it or put it on your website. That's the reason we don't send these things out there, because we did try it a few years ago and then we found some people doing things with it that they shouldn't have been doing with it. And obviously we don't want to get in trouble. Okay, thanks very much.